Alright, in this video we're going to be looking at input validation in C++. I'm going to start off by prompting the user to enter a couple of numbers. We're going to do division operations on those numbers, and then we're going to look at all the different ways that that program could go bad if the user gives us bad input. And then I'll show you how to fix those. So to get started, we're going to prompt the user to enter a dividend. And if I'm going to store that information, normally we would start with two numbers, num1, num2. And then we would say cin, num1, and then we would prompt for the other number. And then we would get num2. And then we could show them the output, num1 divided by num2. And I'll go ahead and run this in a loop so I can test it multiple times. We'll just put a while one up there. So here I am prompted to enter the dividend, so let's just say 25. The divisor, I'll put a 5, and it says the quotient is 5, and that works just fine. But what if we put in some number divided by 0? Well, then my program crashes because you can't divide by 0. So there's one potential error. Let's look at another case here. What if the user enters something like kj that is not a number? Well, now our program breaks as well. So those are a few ways we can break this, and I'm going to show you how to prevent that from happening. Anytime you're doing input validation, you want to take your input in as a string instead of an integer or a float. And so I've included string up here at the top, and I'm going to change these integers to strings. And I'm still calling them num1 and num2, but the computer's going to take them in as characters or as strings instead of integers. And then we will convert them to integers later to do our math. So this part right here will be fine. We will still take in num1 and num2, but we cannot divide two strings. So we'll have to make two integers, and then we will convert those to integers and then do our division operation. Before we convert these, we need to know that everything that the user entered is in fact a number. And we've got a few functions in C++ for checking characters to see if they are numbers or letters or symbols. And so if I wanted to make sure it was a number, I could do a check with a function called isDigit. IsDigit will return true or false based on whether or not that character is a digit. So if I do a cout isDigit, go ahead and comment this out for the moment. If I do cout isDigit, and I throw in a lowercase a, I expect to see a false. And I get all zeros. I forgot I was running in a loop here, but it makes sense, because a is not a digit. Now, if I put in a character that is a digit, such as 5, note the single quotes there, then I'm getting back a 1, which in C++ is true. Anything non-zero is true. And so that's how that function works. Now, when we take in num1 and num2 up here as strings, they are not single characters. So we're going to have to iterate through this string, character by character, and make sure each character is in fact a digit. Because we don't know how many numbers the user typed, we can't just say num1 sub 0. If we did that, it would check the first character, but it would not check all of the characters. So if they entered a 25 or something like this, then we've only validated the 2. We would not have validated the 5. So in order to iterate through a string, we need to set up a for loop. Remember that a string is just an array So we will iterate through it just like we would any other array. Start off with I equals 0, I less than num1 dot length, I plus plus. And then for each character in num1, we want to run that is digit check. So is digit num1 sub I. Now that's going to return our true or false, but we need some way of knowing whether or not this was true or false. So I'm going to set up a bool here. I'll just call it valid. And I'll start it off assuming that they have entered a number. And then I'll run my check here, and I will say if is digit equals false, then valid equals false. And then we can break out of our loop. And then we have our results stored here. If at any point, any character in that string is not a number, then we'll set this to false and we break out. Another way of writing this is a little more professional, is just to put an exclamation point on the front there. It means exactly the same thing. And then I can have an if statement down here that says if valid, see out the number is valid, and else see out the input is not a digit. Now we're only running this check on num1 here, but let's give it a try. Let's see what happens. So our num1 is our dividend. I'm going to enter the correct information. I'll put in a number. And it says the number is valid because 25 is a number. Let's say I put in KL. And then I put in a number. It says the input is not a digit. So that works just fine for num1. We need similar operations for num2. So I'm going to get rid of my if statements here. Just copy my code. Copy this for loop. And we'll change num1 to num2. Now the way I have this set up in main, I would need two different bools. One for each input, but if we were using a function, and we'll move to that later on, we'll get away with just one bool. But for right now, we're going to have two bools, and our second input is going to work on valid 2. Alright, so now we've checked num1 and num2 to make sure they are both numbers, and then if they are, we can perform our division operation and show them our quotient. But we cannot divide strings, even though we've checked to make sure they are numbers. You still cannot perform a division operation on a string. So we'll set up two ints, A and B. And we will say that int A is going to be our num1. And I'll use a function string to integer to convert num1 to an integer. And the same thing for num2. And then instead of dividing num1 and num2, we will divide A and B. So we enter our dividend. I'm going to put in valid numbers this time. That works just fine. Let's put in some letters. P divided by I. And my string to integer crashed because just like the division operation, you cannot convert a letter to an integer. So I cannot run this if my checkup here failed. So these will only happen if valid 1 and valid 2, or valid and valid 2, both check out. So we'll say if valid and valid 2 then we will actually convert the two numbers and make our calculation. So let's try it again. K divided by U, we get nothing. If we put in actual numbers, we get our quotient. And to make this a little bit better, we can put an error message here. We could say else cout invalid input. So let's test that out. Enter a dividend, 36, divided by 6. I get my quotient of 6. Let's try J divided by 5, invalid input. If we do 9 divided by semicolon, invalid input. And it works just fine. We're not breaking anything. And all of our input has been validated. Now, what if I take 5 and I divide it by 0? Now my program is crashed, and so I still have to deal with that. And so we'll look at dealing with those sorts of errors using try-catch blocks. And one last thing, aside from isDigit, we also have isAlpha. You can use it in the same way to see if any character is a letter. So if you put in a letter such as lowercase a or capital C, you're going to get true. If you put in a number or some other character like a semicolon or something like that, you're going to get a false. And then there's also isUnknown. So this one you can use to see if it is a digit or a letter, but you can exclude symbols and other strange characters, like the half symbol or something like that.